I took handfuls of ciprofloxacin for years because I was in constant pain. And thanks again to you, because realizing that I had thought that gluten was an issue for me for so long that I went on a gluten-free diet even when I was vegetarian early on. And a lot of those gluten-free products are filled with nut flours and all kinds of highly oxalate toxic things. But it eventually led to me not being able to handle any amount. And I'm sure for those folks that don't know, there is an oxalate degrading bacteria called Oxalobacter formigenes that Monique can expand on much better than I can. But once it's gone, it's gone. It's very difficult to take a supplement that you can put, from what I understand, to replenish your amount of that. Isn't that right, Monique? And it really speaks to how, with the advent of antibiotics, which saved lives, but also impacted so many folks' gut and digestive capabilities. What does the body do, or how does the body now sequester these oxalates? Many old injury sites, tissues, things like that, I understand.
There does look to be some kind of, it's not so much it's being sequestered there as it's almost like it's attracted to sites of inflammation in the body. So this is not something I think there's been a bunch of research on, but certainly on the triangle oxalate support group, there's a lot of reports of, gee, I've been doing the diet for a while, and all of a sudden this old tennis elbow is acting up. Or, I had falls doing figure skating and other sports when I was a kid, and I'd really knocked my tailbone. And at one point I remember waking up in the morning with my tailbone aching and going, what the heck is that? Like, so it can end up, through whatever mechanism, being trafficked into these places where we've had an injury. And then as the injury heals, you may have oxalate that's kind of being stored in those tissues. A lot of what I know now about how oxalate is trafficked into tissues has to do with some of the information that Susan Owens, who's the original founder of the Triangle Oxalate Support Group, has posted on that group. And that includes things like, certain cell transporters, which move chloride, which move sulfite, which move bicarbonate. Some of these cell transporters also move oxalate. And so you can also get almost like a case of mistaken identity, where your cell transporter goes out into the fluid around the cell to pick up a nutrient that it needs. And let's say it's sulfate, just because that's one of the more common ones where oxalate gets mistakenly picked up. And that would be where you've got a cell transporter that moves both. So it picks up sulfate, but it's supposed to move oxalate out of the cell. Because our bodies do know about oxalate. It's a metabolic endpoint. So cell transporters are used to get oxalate out of the cell. However, if your cell transporter is out there looking for sulfate, but it meets up with an oxalate molecule, and that fits the ending, that cell transporter is not smart enough. It developed in an environment where oxalate came from inside the cell, and what came from outside the cell was the nutrient. And we've kind of put that on its head when we take a lot of oxalate in, because then all of a sudden you have oxalate plentiful in the interstitial fluid around the cell. And you've got these cell transporters who are going out to look for a nutrient, and they're pulling oxalate into the cell. Now, it takes energy for a cell to run a cell transporter. So then maybe the cell can't do what it was going to do to generate energy, and it has to kind of build up energy again before it could do another pull. But what if the next pull is oxalate too? And the next one, and the next one, right? You can actually end up with a situation where it's accumulating in the tissue, because every time cell transporter goes out looking for sulfate, instead of finding sulfate, it's finding oxalate. I think the research is starting to point in the direction of things like that, because there's research now on arthritis, and that there may be oxalate accumulating in joints. There's research in the area of oxalosis, which shows that oxalate may be preferentially turning up in like lots of places in the body, bones, blood vessels, eyes, and what we're seeing on the triangle oxalate groups is that people report those kinds of symptoms long before the kidneys are damaged. So what if it's the oxalate building up in the body that's causing the kidneys to be damaged, as opposed to, oh, the kidneys are damaged and now oxalate's building up in the body? And we just don't see enough, I'd say, curiosity there about that. And honestly, once oxalate starts to drive inflammation, and there is research on that that shows that oxalate can kick off the inflammasome at the cellular level. So once oxalate's kicked off inflammation, all of the kinds of things the body does to deal with inflammation, we may have things going on there which are taking oxalate into places we don't want it to be, but not the least of which could be how we mess with our neurotransmitters. And this is not something that I think there's any research on, but the more I read on how the body handles inflammation, the body's response to inflammation is to treat it as if it's acute. But oxalate inflammation is chronic. So in cases of acute inflammation, what the nervous system does is pull down serotonin, pull down dopamine. If you're doing that constantly, are you setting up, the conditions for anxiety? Are you setting up the conditions for poor sleep? Are you setting up the conditions for all kinds of things? Although I think we just need some curiosity about some of these things, and also need to look at some of the ways that normal human metabolism would affect oxalate trafficking, because we do know that neurotransmitters affect how oxalate gets trafficked, hormones affect how oxalate gets trafficked, cytokines affect how oxalate gets trafficked. And now we are seeing research that shows that histamine affects how oxalate gets trafficked, and salicylate affects how oxalate gets trafficked. And is that in? Is that out? Where is it going? Like, we just have it. The more I look at it, the more I think we've got a toxin which turns our health environment into a three-ring circus where we don't know whether the lions, the tigers, or the bears are loose, but something's wrong.